September 1, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai paused with his hand over the intelligence report. His one good eye, the other lost to American gunners a year earlier, scanned the words before him. Then, in the thick humidity of the operations tent, he laughed out loud. "The Americans have built a new fighter," the report said. "Heavier than a bomber, as wide as a transport. They call it the Hellcat." According to Japanese intelligence, this new aircraft weighed nearly twice as much as the legendary Zero. To Sakai that meant only one thing: another clumsy American failure in aircraft design. Through the open tent flaps, Sakai could see his squadron's Mitsubishi A6M0s gleaming in the morning light, neatly lined up on the pierced steel planking. Sleek, agile, and deadly, these machines had ruled the skies for nearly 2 years. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, every opponent had fallen before the Zero's guns. And now this new Hellcat would surely meet the same fate. What Sakai didn't know, what none of the Japanese naval aviators attending that morning briefing could have known, was that within exactly 30 days that same failure would begin the systematic destruction of Japan's naval air power. The F6F Hellcat would go on to achieve a staggering kill ratio of 19-1, destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 in aerial combat. It would revolutionize carrier warfare, crush Japan's aerial dominance, and expose the fatal flaws that had long gone unnoticed in Japan's aviation philosophy. An aircraft that looked too bulky, too heavy, and too crude would rewrite the mathematics of air supremacy. Within 6 months, many of the pilots who mocked those intelligence reports would be writing farewell letters home, knowing that facing a Hellcat in combat meant near certain death. In September 1943, the confidence of the Imperial Japanese Navy was not arrogance, it was mathematics. Since December 7, 1941, Japan's Naval Air Service had achieved combat ratios that seemed beyond belief. At Pearl Harbor, they had lost just 29 aircraft while destroying 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses for 103 enemy planes. Over Darwin, only 2 Zeros downed while 30 Allied fighters fell. The British Far East Fleet's air arm had been wiped out. The Dutch East Indies Air Force eliminated in days. At the center of this overwhelming dominance was the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that had rewritten the very rules of aerial warfare. When American engineers tested captured Zeros in 1942, they refused at first to believe the data. A fighter with the range of a bomber, the agility of a biplane, and the firepower to destroy anything it caught, it sounded impossible. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's top ace with 87 confirmed kills, described the experience of flying the Zero in his recovered wartime diary. "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not control. American planes fly like trucks, powerful but clumsy. They build fighters as they build cars, heavy, overbuilt, and wasteful." The Zero's extraordinary performance came from a radical design philosophy. Its airframe was built from extra super duralumin, a classified aluminum alloy that made it 30% lighter than comparable American aircraft. But that performance came at a deadly price. There was no armor plate to protect the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fire. Even the radio was often removed, to save just 30 pounds. Every ounce was sacrificed for speed and maneuverability. The first reports of the F6F Hellcat reached Japanese intelligence through neutral Swedish sources in early 1943. The specifications seemed almost laughable: propaganda, perhaps, or deliberate misinformation. The new fighter weighed 12,186 pounds when fully loaded. The Zero weighed only 5,800. The Hellcat's wings spanned 334 square feet, driven by a large drag-heavy radial engine. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, had armor plate throughout, bulletproof glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks holding 250 gallons of fuel. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the specs. His written assessment, preserved in Japanese defense archives, was dismissive. The Americans have learned nothing. This Hellcat continues their failed philosophy, trying to compensate for inferior pilots with weight and machinery. A Zero will fly circles around it. The mathematics appeared to confirm his view. The Zero's wing loading, just 22 pounds per square foot, gave it a turning radius of 612 feet. The Hellcat's wing loading was 36.5 pounds per square foot, giving it a projected turning radius of over 900 feet. In a turning dogfight, the core of Japanese air combat doctrine, the Hellcat should have been helpless. September 30, 1943. Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission when he saw them, 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast. At first he thought they were B-25 bombers flying an unusual course. But as they turned he saw their outlines clearly, single-engine fighters with massive fuselages and short, thick wings. In his after-action report he wrote simply, "First encounter with F6F type fighter. Initial impression, Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber." Fukui engaged using standard zero tactics, turning tightly to slip behind the enemy's tail. He rolled into a diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to continue straight ahead. In seconds he would curve behind it for the kill. But something unexpected happened. The Hellcat didn't run. It didn't try to turn with him. Instead it went vertical. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, hauled the Hellcat skyward at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow but his airspeed dropped rapidly. The Zero's light frame could not fight gravity at that climb rate. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a maneuver that should have been impossible for such a heavy aircraft. A hammerhead turn, pivoting at the top of its climb to drop straight down behind Fukui. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui wrote. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. The volume of fire was overwhelming. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Only by entering a spin did I escape. It was Japan's first glimpse of the new reality in the skies over the Pacific. Fukui survived, but barely. He limped his riddled Zero back to Marcus Island, its fuselage torn with bullet holes and oil streaks running down the wings. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao, never returned. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they had been escorting. The Hellcat had drawn first blood. October 5, 1943, Task Force 14 strikes Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what appeared to be another nuisance raid. 4 months, American carriers had launched these quick hit-and-run attacks, usually retreating before Japanese fighters could properly engage. But this time would be different. "We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga wrote in his diary. "Below us 12 F6F fighters in 3 divisions. We held every advantage, altitude, position, surprise. Victory was certain. The battle that followed would shatter the foundation of Japanese air combat doctrine." As the Zeros dove toward the Hellcats, the American fighters didn't scatter or break formation. They stayed tight, accelerating in a shallow dive that preserved their energy. When the Zeros opened fire at maximum range, hoping for lucky hits, the Hellcats simply absorbed the punishment. Each Hellcat carried over 200 pounds of armor protecting the pilot, 110 pounds shielding the oil system, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could take dozens of hits without igniting. When the Zeros exhausted their ammunition in their diving attacks, the Americans counterattacked. But instead of turning to dogfight, the Hellcats used their weight as a weapon. Climbing at full power, they rose to altitudes where the Zero's engine began to gasp for air. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat's massive Pratt & Whitney engine was still producing 1,650 horsepower. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai could barely manage 900. "They came down on us like hawks upon sparrows," Shiga wrote. "Their weight gave them a speed we couldn't match. They dove, fired those 6 terrible guns, then climbed away before we could even react. By the time the battle ended, 8 Zeros were destroyed. Not a single Hellcat was lost." It was the first clear sign of what would later be called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. At Rabaul, the pilots of the 204th Air Group sat in a stifling briefing room, listening as Lieutenant Commander Tetsuzo Iwamoto's comrade, Tao Tanamizu, addressed them. Tanamizu, a veteran with 32 victories, was one of the few who had survived multiple encounters with the Hellcat. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors." Tanamizu explained what Japanese pilots were slowly, and fatally, realizing. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to never have to. American pilots were employing a revolutionary doctrine known as energy fighting. They maintained altitude and speed, using potential energy to unleash devastating high-speed attacks. Their aim was to strike once, then climb away, leaving Zero pilots with no chance to exploit their superior agility. "They work in pairs," Tanamizu continued. "One high, one low. While you focus on one, the other is already diving on you. Even the radios, once mocked by Japanese aviators as unnecessary weight, gave the Americans an unthinkable advantage. Their communications were seamless. Every maneuver, every vector, perfectly coordinated. "We fly as individual samurai," Tanamizu said quietly. "They fight as a machine." Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now served as the combined fleet's air operations officer. His inspection of damaged Zeros returning from recent battles revealed an increasingly grim truth. Japan was being outclassed by technology. The disparity was measurable, mathematical. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns fired 750 rounds per minute each, a combined rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. Each round weighed 46 grams, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, and delivered 3,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The Zero's two 7.7mm machine guns, by contrast, fired projectiles weighing just 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second, barely 750 foot-pounds of energy each. But it wasn't just firepower. Reports began filtering in of radar-guided interceptions, a concept almost beyond imagination for Japanese pilots. While Japanese squadrons still relied on eyesight and instinct to find their enemies, American Hellcats were being guided to their targets by shipboard radar operators who could track aircraft over 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi described his first encounter with radar-directed fighters. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning. No visual contact. The Hellcats dove from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew where we were, our altitude, our course. We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark." January 1944. Japan's greatest advantage, its elite aviators, was collapsing. Before the war, the Imperial Navy's pilot training program had been the most demanding in the world. It took 3 years to complete. Graduates entered combat with over 700 flight hours. Army pilots averaged 500. They were not just soldiers but artists of the air, masters of aerobatics, precision gunnery, and a spiritual philosophy that equated flight with enlightenment. But by early 1944, the system was breaking down. Fuel shortages, combat losses, and the desperate need for replacements forced Japan to accelerate its training. New naval pilots now entered combat with barely 300 flight hours. Army pilots averaged just 200. Most of their training was conducted in gliders because there was no fuel for powered flight. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot. Formation flying, instrument navigation, and radio procedures were all abandoned to rush young men into combat. Meanwhile, their American counterparts arrived with a minimum of 300 flight hours, including 50 hours in the specific aircraft type they would fly in combat. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, rehearsed carrier landings until they were automatic, and mastered energy tactics in the safety of Texas airfields. At Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, Training Officer Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto summarized the situation in his final report. "We are sending children to fight professionals." He added, almost as a confession, "Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. We have no ammunition for practice. He has never flown at night." The once invincible air arm of the Imperial Navy was disintegrating, one inexperienced pilot, one burning Zero at a time. "We have no fuel for such training." He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. October 12 to 16, 1944, the Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of Japan's Second Air Fleet, threw everything he had into halting the massive American carrier raids striking Formosa. Over 700 aircraft were committed, many flown by the last trained pilots pulled from Japan's homeland training squadrons. Japanese propaganda quickly declared a spectacular triumph. 26 American carriers and battleships sunk, 300 aircraft destroyed. But when pilots returned and gun camera footage was reviewed, the truth emerged, and it was catastrophic. Actual American losses, 89 aircraft. Japanese losses, 329 aircraft, and with them, nearly every remaining experienced pilot. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few veterans to survive, described the horror in his memoirs. "The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below. They had divided the sky into grids, each section covered by a division. It was not combat. It was systematic extermination." Formosa marked the irreversible breaking point. Japan's elite air power, once the terror of the Pacific, was now being dismantled with mathematical precision. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy launched what it believed would be the decisive battle to destroy American carrier strength in the Pacific. Operation Ago. The force, 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, and what remained of Japan's trained naval aviators. Facing them, Task Force 58 with 15 American carriers and 956 aircraft, 450 of them Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa ordered his strike waves with full confidence that superior pilot skill and the Zero's range advantage would once again prevail. The first wave, 69 aircraft, launched at 0830 hours. But American radar detected them 150 miles out. Within minutes, Hellcats were vectored to intercept, guided flawlessly by radar controllers. They approached with every advantage, altitude, position, and the sun blazing behind them, blinding the Japanese formation. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the Japanese fighter escort, saw them first. They were stacked from 20 to 30,000 feet, at least 60 of them, waiting like a steel curtain. We were at 18,000 feet. Every advantage was theirs. The engagement lasted only 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were shot down. Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15, destroyed 7 aircraft that day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, shot down 6 more. McCampbell later described the encounter. The Zeros tried to turn with us. We simply refused. We made high-side runs, fired, then zoomed back up to altitude. They'd try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off. By sunset the results were staggering. Japanese losses, 346 carrier-based aircraft and 50 land-based aircraft. American losses, 30 aircraft from all causes. That evening, in the ready rooms of Task Force 58, American pilots coined a phrase that would enter history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The enemy aircraft had been as helpless as game birds. October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. During this massive engagement, the largest naval battle in history, Commander David McCampbell etched his name into aviation legend. Leading just 7 Hellcats from the USS Essex, he intercepted a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft heading directly toward the American fleet. What followed was a 90-minute aerial massacre. McCampbell shot down 9 enemy aircraft, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers. His wingman, Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill, McCampbell wrote later. The Hellcat performed flawlessly throughout. Not a single hit on my aircraft, despite being outnumbered 8-1. In a single engagement, 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese planes, destroying 15, without a single American loss. McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day performances, 7 kills on June 19 and 9 on October 24, earned him both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. The battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf demonstrated not only the complete reversal of air superiority, but also the psychological breaking point of Japan's air arm. In the aftermath of these defeats, Japanese military psychologists began reporting a new condition among surviving pilots. They called it Hellcat psychosis. The symptoms were unmistakable: crippling anxiety before missions, trembling hands, recurring nightmares, and a fatalistic resignation that combat with Hellcats meant certain death. For the men of the Imperial Navy Air Service, the once glorious image of the samurai pilot had dissolved into terror. The skies that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to the Hellcat. August 15, 1945, the day Japan's Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation for the first time in history. His voice, trembling yet composed, echoed through broken cities and smoldering airfields. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. To millions of defeated soldiers and civilians, those words marked the end. To the surviving aviators of the Imperial Navy, it was a requiem. On remote airstrips across Kyushu and Honshu, men who had once been gods of the sky sat beside the skeletal remains of their Zero fighters and Nakajima bombers, silent. The once proud naval air arm, the force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor, had been annihilated in less than 4 years. Of the 18,000 trained naval aviators who had entered the war, fewer than 100 with combat experience survived. Most were instructors now, too few to rebuild the service, too haunted to believe in its resurrection. In hangars taken over by American occupation forces, the aircraft that symbolized that destruction, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, now stood proudly painted in blue-gray, its wings folded neatly, its victories recorded in tiny white kill markings beneath the cockpit. Pilots who had flown them home looked on with quiet satisfaction, not in triumph, but in disbelief at how absolute the victory had become. For Japan's surviving officers, The reckoning was not only military but moral. Admiral Ozawa, who had once commanded the might of the Imperial fleet at Leyte Gulf, wrote in his final reflections, "We fought against machines that thought, not men. We had courage but they had computation. And courage without calculation is suicide." The Hellcat had redefined air combat. It was not the fastest aircraft, nor the most elegant. But it was the most balanced. A weapon that combined American industry, radar coordination, pilot training, and tactical doctrine into one seamless instrument of war. It turned air combat from an art into an algorithm. A system that rewarded discipline, not instinct. Precision, not passion. In 1946, when captured Japanese pilots were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers, many repeated the same phrase. "We never feared the man. We feared the machine." They spoke of the Hellcat's speed, its resilience, and its uncanny ability to appear from the sun, fire a perfect burst, and disappear again. No maneuver, no trick, no tradition of Bushido could overcome it. For the United States Navy, the F6F Hellcat had done more than win battles. It had secured mastery of the Pacific. It had broken the myth of Japanese invincibility, reclaimed the skies from the Zero, and paved the way for the amphibious invasions that brought America to the gates of Tokyo. Its legacy was engraved not only in numbers, 5,223 aerial victories, 305 aces, a 19-to-1 kill ratio, but in the transformation of air warfare itself. The story of the Hellcat was the story of a shift, from individual heroism to collective efficiency, from daring to doctrine. Every American pilot who strapped into its cockpit was part of a system that extended from radar picket ships miles away to the flight directors aboard carriers and the mechanics who tuned its powerful Pratt & Whitney engines through sleepless nights. And yet, for all its mechanical perfection, its victory was deeply human. Each sortie flown, each enemy aircraft downed, each life saved aboard a carrier deck depended on a man, young, trained, alert, trusting both his machine and the system behind it. It was that unity of man and machine that defined the American air arm in World War II, and that would carry forward into the jet age. By the time Japan surrendered, the Hellcat had already begun to fade from frontline service, replaced by the faster, sleeker F-8F Bearcat and the first generation of jet fighters. But its legend endured, in the quiet pride of the men who flew it, in the humbled respect of those who fought against it, and in the transformation it had forced upon the very concept of air power. In post-war Japan, a handful of surviving Zero pilots visited American bases, standing before rows of Hellcats awaiting decommissioning. One of them, former Lieutenant Zenji Arb, reportedly murmured, "We once believed spirit alone could conquer steel. Now I see, steel can have spirit too." The war that had begun with the Zero ended with the Hellcat. And between them lay the transformation of air combat, from the romance of the lone samurai to the cold, precise efficiency of an industrial civilization at war. As the rising sun set over Tokyo Bay on that August evening, the decks of American carriers were silent, their Hellcats lined wingtip to wingtip in perfect order. Engines quiet. Guns at rest. The machine that had once ruled the Pacific sky stood still, its purpose fulfilled. The age of the Hellcat was over. But its shadow, the legacy of a machine that turned the tide of the Pacific, would shape every fighter, every doctrine, and every pilot who came after. And for those who survived, both American and Japanese, the lesson remained eternal. In war, courage may begin the fight, but only mastery ends it. To the Japanese this was incomprehensible. They had been taught that valor could overcome weakness, that spirit could conquer steel. But the Hellcat was proof that war in the industrial age had outgrown the warrior's code. In the ruins of Yokosuka and Kure, engineers and pilots examined what they could no longer deny. The Americans had not simply built better machines, they had built a better system to build machines. From the ore mines of Minnesota to the assembly lines of Long Island, every rivet, every bolt, every piece of the Hellcat was part of a seamless logistical miracle. Each airplane was identical. Each part interchangeable. In contrast, Japanese aircraft, handmade and fragile, reflected a nation still fighting with the spirit of an earlier century. For the Imperial Navy, the humiliation was profound. What had once been a creed, that the strength of a warrior lay in his willingness to die, now appeared archaic. In the face of an enemy who treated survival, calculation, and precision as virtues, death before dishonor had become a liability. The Hellcat did not fight for glory. It fought to end wars. Its pilots were trained not as duelists but as operators of an integrated weapon system, radar-controlled, radio-directed, coordinated with ships hundreds of miles away. To the Japanese this was alien. To the Americans, It was the inevitable evolution of warfare. When Professor Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, later met American engineers during post-war research exchanges, he was astonished not by their genius, but by their organization. They had designed teams, not heroes, he wrote in his private notes. We had faith in the exceptional man. They had faith in the collective mind. The war had proven which philosophy would define the modern age. By 1945, the Hellcat had turned every American carrier group into a self-contained citadel. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 could steam within striking range of Japan's home islands, knowing that nothing could touch them from the air. Radar picket ships detected incoming raids hours away. Hellcats launched, formed precise defensive screens, and destroyed attackers before they ever saw the fleet. Carriers no longer had to hide. They dared the enemy to come. And when the Japanese did, whether through desperation or devotion, they met a storm of disciplined radar-guided destruction. This new doctrine, born from the Hellcat's success, changed the very nature of sea power. For centuries, navies had been defined by the gun, by the battleship, by range and armor. The Hellcat ended that age. It proved that air dominance, not armor, was the true key to survival. And it did so not through individual brilliance, but through industrial logic, through systems, mass production and relentless standardization. At the Grumman plant in Bethpage, New York, men and women, some still in their teens, worked 3 shifts 7 days a week. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney test stands echoed day and night. Each hour, a new Hellcat rolled off the line, tested, armed and ready to be loaded onto a waiting flat car bound for the docks. Engineers who visited the plant called it a cathedral of precision. Workers used jigs, templates and color-coded instructions that ensured every aircraft was built the same, no matter who assembled it. If a part failed inspection, it was not repaired, it was replaced. Perfection was not the product of skill but of process. The Japanese observers who toured American factories after the war were stunned. One officer wrote, "We saw not craftsmen but an army of machines." The Americans have turned production into warfare itself. In truth, that was the secret of the Hellcat. It was not just a fighter, it was the industrial age given wings. In post-war interrogations, former Japanese pilots struggled to articulate what had happened. They had not been cowardly. They had fought bravely, often suicidally. Yet time and again, they were slaughtered by opponents who fought with calm precision, as if guided by invisible hands. When asked what he feared most in combat, one Japanese ace replied simply, "The calm voice on their radios." It never trembled. That voice, directing Hellcats into perfect intercept positions, vectoring divisions by radar, coordinating attacks with mechanical precision, symbolized the new world order. A world where data replaced instinct, and machines extended the reach of human reason. To the samurai generation this was soul-crushing. Their nation's warriors had fought with passion, but the war had been decided by the cold logic of industry. Steel, oil, electricity, and mathematics, these were the new swords of empire. In the years following Japan's surrender, the Hellcat was retired from active service, replaced by jet aircraft. But its impact endured. Every naval fighter that followed, from the Panther to the Phantom, from the Tomcat to the Super Hornet, carried its lineage. The emphasis on survivability, visibility, power, and stability all traced back to the F6F. Even Japan's post-war air industry, reborn under American guidance, adopted many of the same principles the Hellcat had embodied: mass production, interchangeability, and systematic training. The samurai spirit gave way to the engineer's blueprint. For historians, the Hellcat remains more than a machine. It is a symbol of transformation, the moment when human valor yielded to human intellect, when craftsmanship gave way to industry, when the art of war became the science of systems. And for those who lived through its reign, friend or foe, its meaning was simple. It was the plane that ended the war of the warrior and began the war of the world. As the last Hellcats were decommissioned and scrapped, one stood preserved in the Smithsonian, its blue paint still bearing the faded victory marks of 1945. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, "Grumman F6F Hellcat, the fighter that freed the Pacific." In that simple inscription lies the truth of its legacy. Not just the victory of one aircraft, but the triumph of a civilization that learned to turn knowledge, discipline, and precision into power. The Hellcat had not merely defeated its enemies. It had redefined what it meant to fight, and what it meant to win. The laughter that once echoed through the ready rooms of Rabaul, Truk, and Formosa had long since fallen silent. By 1945, there was no one left to laugh. Only the distant roar of American engines and the silence of empty hangars, the graves of a vanished Air Force. The F6F Hellcat was more than an airplane. It was the manifestation of an idea, that wars in the modern age would not be won by courage alone, but by systems, science, and the collective power of a nation mobilized for total war. The Japanese had sought glory. The Americans had sought victory. And the Hellcat delivered it with mathematical precision. When Japan entered the war, its fighter pilots were heirs to a centuries-old warrior creed. Their instructors spoke of honor, of individual mastery, of the spirit that could overcome any obstacle. The Zero was their symbol, fast, graceful, and pure in design. It embodied the Bushido spirit in metal. But the Hellcat was born of a different world, a world of blueprints, laboratories, production quotas, and assembly lines. It was not a duelist's blade, it was a factory-made hammer built to crush, not to dance. And it was wielded by pilots who understood that survival was victory, that living to fight another day was not cowardice but strategy. To the Japanese this logic was alien. To the Americans, it was the essence of modern warfare. The two philosophies collided in the skies above the Pacific, and one of them ceased to exist. Every Hellcat that rolled off the Grumman assembly line carried within it the weight of a nation's intellect and industry. Its engine had more horsepower than the Zero weighed. Its armor turned deadly hits into survivable damage. Its guns, 6 Browning M2s, could tear through aluminum and spirit alike. But its greatest weapon was not its firepower. It was its forgiveness. A Hellcat could take damage, lose oil pressure, or even a cylinder and still bring its pilot home. It gave men a chance to survive, and survival, multiplied by thousands, became inevitability. The Zero demanded perfection. The Hellcat tolerated humanity. That was the real difference. When post-war Japan rebuilt, it did so with the memory of the Hellcat engraved in its national consciousness. Factories became the new battlefields. Precision, process, and production replaced sacrifice as the highest virtue. The lesson had been cruel, but it was understood. In the age of industry, the soul of the warrior must evolve, or perish. Professor Horikoshi, in his later writings, reflected not on defeat, but on transformation. The Hellcat, he wrote, was not our enemy. It was our teacher. From that acknowledgement emerged a new Japan, one that traded swords for circuits, spirit for science, and vengeance for innovation. Ironically, the very lesson taught by the Hellcat would make Japan one of the world's foremost industrial powers within a generation. The weapon that destroyed them had also shown them the path forward. In the cold arithmetic of history, emotion fades, but the figures remain. 12,275 Hellcats built, more than double the total number of Zeros from 1943 onward. 5,223 aerial victories, more than any other naval aircraft in history. 19-to-1 kill ratio, a number that defied belief even among its own pilots. 305 American aces, including David McCampbell, whose 34 kills made him the highest-scoring U.S. Navy ace of all time. Fewer than 100 experienced Japanese naval aviators left alive by August 1945. The numbers were merciless. They told the story of a machine that had not only dominated a battlefield but rewritten the principles of aerial warfare itself. In his final interview, Saburo Sakai's words carried the quiet dignity of a man who had looked into the face of history and accepted its verdict. The Zero made us proud, he said. The Hellcat made us humble. He paused, then added softly, every Japanese pilot who lived because a Hellcat allowed him to. It was the most profound admission of all, that survival itself had become an act of mercy granted by an enemy's superiority. Admiral Ozawa's remark echoed this truth with haunting clarity. We mocked the Hellcat for its weight, its armor, its lack of elegance. But we did not understand that every pound was a measure of the strength behind it, the strength of a nation that built to win, not to impress. By the time Japan understood, the war was already lost. The skies that had once been filled with the graceful arcs of Zeros now belonged to the blunt, roaring precision of the Hellcat, the sound of an empire collapsing under the weight of modernity. When the last Hellcats were decommissioned, few mourned them. Their work was done, their dominance absolute. But their legacy endured. In every jet fighter, every integrated combat system, every doctrine that valued coordination over courage and endurance over ego. The Hellcat was not just the plane that won the Pacific. It was the machine that ended the age of the warrior and began the age of the system. In that transformation lies the true meaning of its last laugh. Because in the end, the Hellcat didn't merely defeat the Zero. It defeated the idea that bravery alone could conquer technology, that willpower could stand against organization, that a sword could still prevail against a world now armed with machines. The Japanese pilots had laughed when they first saw the F6F Hellcat. But history and the skies above the Pacific would remember whose laughter echoed last.